It's lovely to see that so many of you have turned out, and it's great to see that there's such an interest in the history of East Belfast, because East Belfast has a very interesting history. And big houses and grand families are not necessarily what people think of when they think of the east of the city. They think of the great engineering works, they think of the little houses, they think of anything of the middle class. They don't think of the great houses. And yet Belfast in its heyday, and the heyday of Belfast was the period before the First World War. At its height, Belfast had nearly 400 substantial mansions in and around it. Now, these weren't the mansions of the country gentry. These were the mansions of the people who made their money out of Belfast. And believe me, they made some amount of money in their time. Some of it deserved, some of it possibly not deserved. I'm not here to give judgments one way or another. But Belfast at one time generated an enormous amount of money. And unusually for the United Kingdom, nearly all that money stayed in Belfast. In England, what tended to happen when people made money out of industrial cities like Bradford or wherever, they tended, when they made their money out of their mills, to send their children to public school, to buy a landed estate and try and forget that they ever made their money out of a mill. I was actually over in Bradford Museum a few years ago speaking, and I was talking about the rise of Belfast and about the wealth of Belfast. And the reception afterwards, I was talking to one of the councillors, and I said to him, I suppose Bradford was like Belfast, there must have been areas of great wealth and big houses around Bradford. And he said, don't you believe it? As soon as anybody made any money out of Bradford, they got the hell out of Bradford. Now, that wasn't entirely true, but it was true to a bit. But Belfast wasn't like that. Belfast, those who made their money from trade were generally very proud of it, and they tended to build their houses in and around the city. And as I say, at one time there was a great deal of money. Just to give you an idea of that, every so often I come across something that reminds me of how much money there was in Belfast. You'll all have heard of the famous Belfast or Northern Ireland poet, Louis MacNeice. Well, Louis MacNeice, when he was talking about his life, talked about his stepmother, and he said of his stepmother that she belonged to one of those Belfast business families who spent their time between their dreary mansion overlooking Belfast Lough and their even drearier mansion overlooking Regent's Park in London. Now, who has a mansion overlooking Regent's Park these days, dreary or otherwise? Usually Russian billionaires. And that's the kind of money. You know, Edward Harland, who we all know, had a house at Orbison, which is still there. That was only a side residence, if you like. Edward Harland spent most of his days at his house just beside Kensington Palace. A house now that I believe is valued at about 100 million. That is the kind of money that lurked about. But to give you an idea of something of the history, and to tell you a little bit about some of the families, because if I was just to do a catalogue of houses, it would be pretty boring. I'm not sure, is this mic working all right? Yes. You can, because I can't tell from here, but if you have a problem, as I say, let me know. The first probably big house to be built anywhere in East Belfast was Mount Pottinger. And the Pottingers, like so many of these families, were a Scottish business family. Came over in the 17th century, established themselves just off High Street in Belfast, in what became Pottinger's Entry. And what happened in those days with these trading families is that they were nearly all at their houses, their businesses, their warehouses and their offices around High Street, because the river came up High Street and their ships came up High Street, and they established themselves there. And those little streets that ran off High Street were called after the great families. So you had Pottinger's Entry, you had Leg's Lane, you had Bigger's Entry, you had McCartney's, you had Wilson's Court, all named after them. And that's where the Pottingers started. Very enterprising family. And they were the first to decide, as Belfast increased, that there was money to be made in the east of the city, which was empty at that time. And they took a lease on Ballymacarrot, which cost them £300. A very good investment, as it turned out. Now, if they'd held on to it, it would have been an even better investment, but they got Ballymacarrot for £300, and on the only bit of high ground between the Connswater and the Lagan, they built a house, and they called it Mount Pottinger. And that was their house, and there the Pottingers remained for 100 years. Eventually, the Pottingers got a very good offer for their estate at Ballymacarrot from a man called Baron Yeverton, who was something of an entrepreneur. And he decided that the other side of the river was owned by the Chichesters, the Marquises of Donegal, and the town of Belfast was growing, but in the 18th century it wasn't doing much. And he decided that if he got the east bank of the river, that he could create a town that would be the rival to Belfast. That he would create not a suburb of Belfast, but a completely new town at Ballymacarrot. And he paid the Pottingers £18,000 for the lease, which was a pretty good improvement of 300. Remember, £18,000 in those days, you're talking about probably about 2.5 million, £3 million. Not a vast amount, but a fair amount of money. The Pottingers managed to retain their own house, Mount Pottinger, but they sold off the land. As I say, now, once Yeverton started to develop or started to hand out leases in Ballymacarrot, the Chichesters who owned the other side of the river, the County Antrim side, became very annoyed. Now, the Marquis of Donegal was a very, very powerful man indeed. And the Chichesters were a very powerful and ruthless clan. And they decided they weren't going to put up with it. Now, they could have gone to law, they could have done all sorts of things, but the Marquis of Donegal decided on different tactics. He basically employed a whole crowd of thugs whose job it was to go over the river and threaten anybody who was going to take a lease there with violence, to break up any building that was being built and to generally cause havoc and get the whole area a bad name. Very nice behaviour for the chief aristocrat in Northern Ireland, but maybe that's why Belfast business families never had a very high opinion of the aristocracy. It didn't work. Barry Yeverton was made of stronger stuff and he refused to give in. So in the end, the Marquis of Donegal had to buy him out. And he bought him out for $25,000. So the value of Ballymacarrot was gradually going up. Once he had bought out the leases in Ballymacarrot, he never did much more about it. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that family later on. But to get back to the Pottingers, the reason that I'm principally interested in the Pottingers, apart from the fact that they were the first to establish themselves really in East Belfast, is because of one member of that family. And that member was Henry Pottinger, who some of you may have heard of and others not. I heard of Pottinger very early in my life because Pottinger, like most of these families, even however great they became, they sent their children to the local schools. So Pottingers all went to Belfast Academy, later Belfast Royal Academy. I went there as a boy, and like all these schools, you'd be familiar yourself, they split them up into houses to play sport. And they named the houses after old boys or benefactors, and I was in the house called Pottinger. And I remember asking teachers, because I was always interested in history, very annoying for them, but I asked them who Pottinger was. Nobody knew. Somebody suggested he was a famous athlete. Somebody told me that he was a benefactor who built a new wing to the school. Nobody knew. Well, I'll tell you who Henry Pottinger was if you don't know. Henry Pottinger was the man who founded Hong Kong, one of the greatest cities in the world. And Henry Pottinger was also probably one of the most interesting men I've ever came across. He left Belfast Academy at the age of 14, which he did in those days. He wasn't an eldest son, so he wasn't getting the family business. So at 15, he was sent off to seek his fortune in India. This was pretty common, you know, pretty ruthless in those days. If you were a younger son, they tended to pack you off to the colonies. You see, you either made money or died, but neither way you weren't a drain on the family estates. Very often they would claim that somebody was sent away to Jamaica or somewhere because of their poor health. Well, the sure thing to improve your health was to be 6 months in a boat to Jamaica. But he wasn't, he was sent to India. And why he became an important person really was because he turned out not only to be very, very intelligent and able, but also to have a great ability with languages. That's not something we're noted for in Northern Ireland now or even in the past. And when he was out in India, he was sent to work for the East India Company, who you may all have heard of. East India Company basically ran or founded the British Empire, a private company, had its own army, had its own civil service, and very, very powerful trading organisation. He went to work for them, and he turned out to be brilliant at languages, which was very useful for them, because it seems most of them were absolutely useless at languages, and being able to speak some of these languages was very good for trade. But he was also a very adventurous young man. Remember, he was very young and very reckless. And the East India Company started sending him on secret missions. This was pure boys' own adventure stuff. The sort of thing they loved in the Edwardian days we would consider was nonsense. On one particular occasion, the East India Company and the British government was threatened because the Russians were doing a deal with Persia. They still are, but it was always the big threat to India was that the Russians on the border would do a deal with Afghanistan and the Persians. And Persia was becoming very anti-British, and they had sent various missions and they'd all been killed. So they decided to send young Henry Pottinger, and he set off with his faithful native servant, his face blacked up, wearing a turban. And he was sent there. After 6 months, they didn't hear a word, and his family were notified that the Dustin would never be heard of again. But 18 months later, he turned up at the Colonial Club in Calcutta and was immediately thrown out for being a native. He then pulled off his turban and said, "Look, it's me, Henry Pottinger, I'm back." True boys' home stuff. And he was able to negotiate a treaty. He was able to do all sorts of things. Not only that, he wrote a book about his experiences, his adventures there, which turned out in the early 19th century to be a bestseller. So he became quite a famous man, was involved in all sorts of things. I'd be here all day and we'd never get to anybody else if it was to cover it all. But the main reason he's famous is that the British government and the East India Company decided that as he was so good at negotiating in India, they would send him to China. Now, he did explain to them that the Chinese didn't speak any Indian language, they spoke Mandarin, which he didn't speak, or Cantonese, but they decided they'd send them anyway to China. Now, in China, in Peking, there is an exhibition of the rise of China, and in it there are pictures of what they would refer to as the foreign devils. Those are mainly from the East India Company, the people that they believe plundered and humiliated China in the 19th century. Prominent among those is a picture of the great barbarian, Mr. No-No, Henry Pottinger of Belfast. He was the man who negotiated with the Chinese imperial government. And why he said no always was he wanted a trading post that was entirely under British control and under British law. He thought it was far too risky. He thought China was too chaotic and the imperial government too unreliable and too cut off to be trusted. Whether he was right or wrong, I don't, it's not for me to say. But he was an extremely skilled negotiator, and he got the Chinese to grant Hong Kong Island to Britain forever as on the treaty. Now, I say forever because long after Henry was dead, the Foreign Office negotiated a new treaty for what was known as the New Territories outside Hong Kong Island, for which they agreed to hand it back in 100 years, which they had to do. Henry would be spinning in his grave. He would never have negotiated that. He negotiated for good, and he got Hong Kong and founded Hong Kong, basically one of the greatest cities in the world. He was also the first governor of Hong Kong. He later was called back to India. Incidentally, he learned both Mandarin and Cantonese and spoke them fluently, to the great annoyance of the Chinese, who believed that the foreign devils were incapable of learning proper Mandarin. How good he was at it, I don't know, but he certainly was brilliant in languages. He went back to India, where he was governor of Madras. He was knighted and then became a baronet. He was very cross because he believed the British government should have given him a title as Lord and let him sit in the House of Lords. But he believed the British government wouldn't give him a title because he didn't have a country house. And therefore they were very keen on keeping up the dignity of the nobility, and they were afraid that Henry really didn't cut the mustard, having gone to a grammar school and didn't have, but he was very cross about it. But he did become a baronet, and eventually they sent him to South Africa where there were problems, and he became governor of what they called the Cape Colony. Basically South Africa was his last post. Now he virtually never got home from the age of 14 on. He was basically out. Occasionally he got back to London, but he virtually never got home to Northern Ireland. But it seems when he was in Cape Town, he reckoned that there were views of Table Mountain that reminded him of the Cave Hill from looking across, and he became homesick. And quite late in life, he decided that he was going home, that he'd had enough, and he was going home. So he sailed for home, but he took ill. And he never made it. He died in Malta on the way back. Now, he may have decided he was going home because he wasn't well, who knows. But he died with tremendous honours, greatly remembered. But as I say, by the time I went to Belfast Royal Academy, he'd been largely forgotten. And I was greatly annoyed when there was the handover of Hong Kong that there was virtually no mention of Henry Pottinger. There are no Pottingers left of that family in Northern Ireland at all. There are Pottingers. There's a Professor Pottinger in Oxford who has corresponded with me, and there has been a biography of Pottinger, I believe, some years ago, but amazing man. And not alone, as I say, in East Belfast by any means. In terms of the great estates in East Belfast, probably the greatest was in southeast Belfast, and that was the Hills estate at Beaver. The Hills, where Moses Hill was one of the British commanders during the wars of the early 17th century. Him and Chichester and Conway were the main British commanders, and won those extremely ruthless wars against Gaelic Ulster. They were rewarded pretty well. Chichester got vast estates, and the Hills also got vast estates. I'll just say a little bit. It was very hard to mention Belfast without mentioning the Chichesters who owned it. The Chichesters, Marquesses of Donegal, due to their military command in the early 17th century, got a great deal of County Antrim. They got 90,000 acres. Now, I don't suppose being Belfast people you're very au fait with what acres are, but a big field is 3 acres, and Lord Dunleith, who's one of our biggest landowners in Northern Ireland, owns 1,000 acres. So believe me, 90,000 acres is a heck of a lot of County Antrim. They own 300,000 acres in Donegal, and they own Lough Neagh. One of their titles was Admiral of Lough Neagh. Now, they also owned all of Belfast, and after purchasing Ballymacarrat, they owned Belfast on both sides of the Lagan. They owned half of Carrickfergus. Now, if they'd held on to this, they would have been one of the greatest families in Europe, but they didn't. And they never really managed to develop Belfast. The reason being, they never were able to raise enough money. The first Marquess of Donegal spent most of his time in England, and he spent an enormous amount of his wealth building a huge mansion. But he didn't build it here in East or West or North Belfast. He built it in Staffordshire. He called it Fisherwick Place. It's why we get Fisherwick in Belfast and Fisherwick Presbyterian Church. But the rotter, instead of building it here, built this enormously expensive mansion in Staffordshire. Capability Brown led out the park. He was a great reader, or claimed to be. He spent £20,000 in books for the library. Well over $1 million in today's terms. Though I was told that most of the books were still in boxes when he died. So he may not have been a great reader, but who knows. He spent an enormous amount of money on that. He also had to find the money to buy out Ballymacarrat, so he had a lot of debt against the estate. But his main problem, as is so often with families, his main problem was a totally reckless son. His eldest son was one of the most reckless, irresponsible young men who have ever lived. By the time that the Ballymacarrat was bought out, the Marquis of Donegal's son was in prison for debt. Hard to believe when you had that sort of money. But his father had stopped paying his debts. His father had paid huge amounts of his debts. He finally disgraced himself almost totally by being put in prison for debt, his father refusing to pay, and him getting a card sharp, and also a man who was a loan shark, a man called May, surname May, to pay his debts on the understanding that the future Marquis of Donegal married his daughter. Not only his daughter, but his illegitimate daughter. So the future greatest landowner in the north of Ireland ended up having to marry a card sharp's illegitimate daughter in the prison in order to get out. His father was disgusted. He wanted to cut him out of the will, but he couldn't. These great estates are entailed to the title, so that the title is never embarrassed. The idea was that you protect the House of Lords by always protecting the title. Nobody wants earls and dukes with no money. So the money was, no matter what scoundrel it is, the money and the title had to come to him. But the bit of Ballymacarrat that had been bought was not part of the estate, and he was able to leave that to his younger son. That younger son became Lord Templemore, and that younger son, who was a very able guy, decided to develop East Belfast as a new town, laying out Templemore Avenue, etc. But he ran into the problem that these people always run into. To develop a town or to develop great estates, you need huge amounts of capital. Huge amounts. This was the early 19th century. There were no limited companies. If you went into this and it went wrong, you lost everything in it. And the trouble was that for them, it was very, very difficult to raise. Not only was it hard to raise the money, but you weren't going to get any return on the money for many, many years. You know, it could take 10 years to get the planning and get things laid out. It could take another 10 years before you were getting any real returns. In the meantime, you were paying out huge amounts of money and interest. So in the end, Lord Templemore leased the estate, some of it to the Bloomfield Land Development Association, which developed a lot of it. But the other, meanwhile, I have to say, the main branch of the family who owned the whole of Belfast, the second Marquis of Donegal, when he eventually succeeded from his father, managed to spend everything. The family that he married into, May became his agent and everything else. May did very well out of it all. That's why you get May Street in Belfast and May's Meadows and May's Market and everything else. The Mays did extremely well. Marquis of Donegal managed to bankrupt what was one of the greatest fortunes there ever was. Even Queen Victoria was appalled at the time. Very, very reckless man. But most of his time was not connected to East Belfast, so I don't want to go into his wonderful and reckless career. He died at Ormeau Park, was where he lived, so just over the river, but no more. We can't really include him as East Belfast. The other great family, as I say, that owned the land were the Hills. The Hills got most of County Down, or 90,000 acres of County Down. In the 18th century, the Hills split their great estates in two. One branch of the family became Marquises of Downshire. They got Hillsborough Castle and all the land stretching down from Hillsborough towards the Mournes. The other branch of the family got the title of Lord Dungannon, Baron Dungannon, and they got the land in around South East Belfast and Castlereagh. They got a lot of Castlereagh. And they built what was probably the greatest mansion anywhere near Belfast. They built Beaver Park. Now, there's very few here today that would remember Beaver Park. But Beaver Park was an enormous, splendid mansion in a magnificent park. It was built originally in the 1740s by Baron Dungannon. He laid out, as I said, a magnificent park on the Lagan. In order to build it, he had an entire village demolished and everybody in it moved. very unpopular, but he built them a new village. The village he demolished was Breda. He built them a new village called Newton Breda. But they weren't very pleased. Belfast people are not necessarily terribly keen on the aristocracy, and there were things about stories of the time saying that where once 300 honest men once dwelt, now one dishonest one lords it over all. That was Lord Dungannon. But the family were quite distinguished because Lord Dungannon's daughter was the mother of the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington's mother was the Countess of Mornington, and she was brought up at her family home was Beaver Park. And in fact, the Duke of Wellington's boy was frequently there. He was also frequently at his aunt's house nearby, Annandale. Was also one of the family houses. His mother, after the death of her husband, who was a Dublin aristocrat, spent a lot of her time at Annandale and was very, very happy there. Annandale, incidentally, which I'm not going to be talking about, Annandale's splendid 18th century mansion too. As there are many women here today, I have to tell you the fact that it's not there is your fault. It was burnt down by the suffragettes. It was said that it wasn't owned by the family then, it was owned, I think, by somebody from Belfast Council or JP or something. It was said that they hadn't intended to burn it down, the fire was just a protest, but they lit it far too well, the whole house burned to the ground. But Beaver Park was a much grander mansion, and as I say, historically enormously important house. But unfortunately, the Lord Dungannon, who was a cousin of the Duke of Wellington, was another one of these reckless young men. These Regency rakes that you may have heard of or seen written about in romantic fiction of the time. These were extremely reckless young men who believed that to take any interest in money was to be boarding and middle class. That a real sporting gentleman paid his debts and never gave a damn. Well, the result was they were fleeced by everybody, and they ended up ruining their estates and ruining themselves. And unfortunately, the Duke's cousin had got his way through most of the fortune by the time he was 28. And Beaver Park had to be sold. It was closed up first of all, and then it was sold at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, there was a great debate over who would buy this magnificent mansion. There was talk of the Marquis of Hertford buying it. There was talk of all sorts of aristocrats buying it. There was horror among the aristocracy and gentry when, instead of an aristocrat buying it, it was bought by a couple of Belfast businessmen. Mr. Baddison and Mr. Legg bought it. The Baddisons later described themselves as English gentry. They weren't. Like the Leggs, the Baddison were wine and spirit merchants initially. The Baddisons lived in Orangefield. They were a very distinguished Belfast business family, originally in the wine and spirit trade. They then started, along with Mussenden and Adair, they started Belfast's first bank and discovered there's even more money in banking than there is in selling spirits, and they made a fortune. They lived in Ormeau from 1720 for nearly 100 years. There's a magnificent painting of them in the Ulster Museum of Mr. Pattison and his family at Orangefield. And they were the people who came forward and bought the estate. The Leggs took part of it, the part over in South Belfast at the Malone, and built Malone House. The rest of the great estate and the mansion went to Pattison. Now, it was assumed by a lot of people that Pattison had bought the estate in order to split it up and make money. And in fact, at the auction, he was approached by a couple of gentry who said to him, "Mr. Pattison, what do you intend to do with Beaver Park? Obviously, you don't intend to live there, it wouldn't suit you at all." And Pattison is supposed to have replied, though the story is probably apocryphal, "No, my man, you're quite right, it wouldn't suit me. The house is far too old-fashioned and not nearly big enough." Probably not true, that the Belfast business family loved the story, they couldn't stand the aristocracy. But Pattison did, he nearly doubled his house when he bought it. And the Pattisons lived there for the rest of the 19th century. And all that, this mic's travelling a bit, should I stand back? Can you still hear me if I'm back a bit? Or, you know, sorry, as I say, I can't really tell from here, I don't want to get feedback from it. Is that okay? Yeah, brilliant. I'll probably get bad back from hunching over, but never worry. All in a good cause. Yes, the Battersons lived there for the whole of the 19th century, and all the great and good, including royalty, went to Beaver Park. At the end of the 19th century, the Battersons who'd gone into politics got a title, Lord Derrimore, and one of them married into a Yorkshire family and they moved to England. Now, there's an interesting thing. Right up until they moved to England and joined the English gentry, they never referred to themselves as anything other as their ancestors as Belfast merchants. They sometimes referred to them as merchant princes, but they always referred to themselves as Belfast merchants. As soon as they became English gentry, they got an entry in the Brets which said the original Mr. Battison they had discovered through a genealogist had been a landowner in Yorkshire who had sold his estates in order to come and live at Orangefield. I don't believe it for 1 second. I think the Battisons were simply business people. But it did show that in England, in order to be part of the great and the good, you had to show that you were a landowner. No good being a banker, however good. Orangefield incidentally passed to another family of bankers, the Hewsons, who married into the Blackisons, and Blackiston Hewsons got it. And remained at Orangefield for well over 100 years. The house at Orangefield, which some of you may remember, the ruins of it at least, that house is not the original house that the Battisons lived in. The Blackiston Hewsons found it too small and knocked the original house down in the 1850s and built a very grand Victorian mansion, possibly because they had 12 children and needed somewhere to put them. They also had 19 servants, I believe, so you needed a hell of a lot of space for that. A very fine mansion. The last people to live in it as a private home were the Dixons. The future Lord Cleland lived there for a time in the 30s before it was sold. Eventually, it was only knocked down in the 70s. But it hadn't been lived as a private house from the 30s. It used to be 4 gate lodges to it, and the original estate stretched out to Grand Parade on one side, the Castlereagh Road, and up Jill Carriageway, so it was a big, big area. Very, very fine mansion, indeed. Now, it's impossible to mention great houses in East Belfast without mentioning Stormont Castle, which, thank God, is still there. Nearly wasn't, by the way. But it's still there. It was built by the Cleland, or Cleland, sometimes the English pronounce them Cleland, here we tend to pronounce them Cleland, or Cleland. The Cleland family owed their fortune entirely to one man, John Cleland. John Cleland studied theology at university, got a degree, got a job as a teacher at Armagh Royal, and was lucky to have among his pupils a young Mr. Stewart, who later became Lord Castlereagh, and made a great bond with Stewart. And when Stewart left school, he became his tutor, and when Stewart went on the great grand tour around Europe, Stewart went with him. So when they came back, Lord Castlereagh, as he later became, only interest was in politics, so he needed somebody to run the estate. So he got John Cleland, to run his estate. He also got John Cleland to become ordained and gave John Cleland basically the Church of Ireland rectorship of Newton Arch, which was worth money as well. So Cleland ended up in a very nice position, agent to the Mount Stewart estate and Church of Ireland clergyman, and made a good marriage. He married a young woman who, through her, inherited a house that in those days was referred to as Mount Pleasant. He changed the name of it to Stormont or Stormmount, maybe because he had a rocky marriage, or he thought it was a joke, or he liked the name, nobody knows. But it became Stormont. Not the house you see at the moment, it was quite a modern house. But John Cleland made a very great deal of money, so much money that when Lord Castlereagh was standing for election, the election cost him 60,000. Elections in those days were totally corrupt. He basically bought off everybody. And this was very expensive. John Cleland lent his employer £30,000. So John Cleland was doing damn well out of the Mount Stewart estates. John Cleland, as you might be aware, is generally a great bogeyman and a greatly detested figure. If you've ever read Betsy Gray and the Hearts of Down, or any fiction about the 98 Rebellion, John Cleland is the bad guy. Not only as rector, but as agent of the estates, justice of the peace, and many other things. He was relentless in fighting the men of 98 and getting them to court, including a number of Presbyterian clergymen, and also resulting in quite a few people being hanged and transported. Now, I have to say that I don't necessarily carry the popular view in these matters. John Cleland was an absolutely ruthless, efficient man, but these people were his enemies. If you get yourself involved in the Northern Rebellion or Civil War, there's a damn good chance you'll get yourself killed. And the 98 Rebellion was one of the least well thought out rebellions in history. It had great thoughts behind it. In terms of execution, it was a bloody shambles. And it was lucky that more people weren't killed. But anyway, John Cleland came out of it very well, but with a reputation of being greatly hated. He decided that it was money to build himself a new house at Stormont, but he didn't live long to enjoy it. He died a few years later. His son Samuel succeeded, considered to be a chip of the old block and not liked either. Samuel came to a true poetic justice end, because when Samuel succeeded, he started to lay a new park out around Stormont to enjoy, but unfortunately for him, there was a house nearby that blocked his view. Now, the family owned the house, but it was leased, and the man who owned it wouldn't sell them the lease, but he owed money to the Clelands and to the Mount Stewart estate, and they got him evicted. And Samuel wanted the house demolished so that the man wouldn't return, and also to improve the view. So he called people in to have it knocked down right away, who it seems didn't know what they were doing. They were just local thugs, and he went down to supervise, and the house fell on him and killed him. Proving perhaps that God was indeed a Presbyterian, but he did have a family, and they were quite young at the time, and his young son John Cleland succeeded, and it was John Cleland who built the present castle in the mid-19th century. Now, when I say built, the original house is still in there. There's an original 18th century house covered up by turrets and things hidden in underneath. The big tower was put in, but this was quite common in Ireland, where there are quite a few that look like castles actually have a very plain 18th century house underneath. It was a lot cheaper. Also, the interior was never Gothic or Scottish baronial, it was always classical. Very nice too, lovely interior. The Clelands lived there until the beginning of the 20th century. The last man to live there in it as a private house before it was bought by the government was Charles Allen. Charles Allen was one of three partners in the great enterprise that was the shipyard of Workman Clark, the small shipyard. Charles Allen was one of the three partners. Largely forgotten yard today. It closed in the 30s. The partners sold out in 1920 and made a great deal of money. Workman himself lived at the Moat, which is a house you might be aware of, the old Hollywood Road. Split up now into apartments and things, but it's still there at the Moat. Very good. They made an enormous amount of money out of that, and George Allen was the last person to live at Stormont. The estate was then bought, as you're aware, by the government, and there was a plan. The original plan, which Craig approved, was to knock Stormont Castle down. Partly the style of it was very unpopular. Gothic Victorian architecture wasn't liked. It was considered to be terribly old-fashioned. It was considered to ruin the view that would emerge of Stormont buildings that they were planning. Luckily, Captain Dixon, Herbert Dixon, who became Lord Glentarran, said, he knew a lot more about the people of East Belfast than most of the MPs, said, look, people in East Belfast would like that. They have an affection for that castle, they like it, and it will look extravagant and ruthless to knock it down. He got them to preserve it, and it's still there, thank goodness. Incidentally, I mentioned about Workman Clark and that shipyard. Shipyards in those days, hard to believe today, but shipyards made gigantic fortunes in the past. And just to come back to, I said the Pattersons left and went to England at the beginning of the 20th century. But when they left, they leased Beaver Park to another shipyard man, and that was Wilson, who was the junior partner in Harland and Wolff. Wilson lived originally in Stranmillis House, which would be still buried there within Stranmillis College. Magnificent house, but he reckoned it wasn't big enough, and it was no good for shooting pheasants. And he wanted somewhere that was within an hour of the yard that he could shoot pheasant, and that he could entertain his friends and business colleagues in proper style. And he took on he took on Beaver Park. Now, he wanted to buy it, but the Pattison family wouldn't sell. They leased it to him. It was still a private house right up to basically the Second World War. During the war, like all the big houses, it was used by the army. And a lot of these houses were left in very poor condition. Sadly, Beaver was left in poor condition. The Pattisons tried to sell it. A house that they could have sold easily before the First World War was unsellable after the Second World War. There was no money in Northern Ireland at that stage. Northern Ireland had been one of the richest, Belfast, one of the 10 richest cities in the world. One time was pretty poor after the Second World War, after the crash of the 30s and everything else. There was no money. This house wasn't alone in not being, you couldn't sell any of them. The Dunville's Great House, which had been built for £60,000 just outside Hollywood, was sold with its estate for £7,000, 100 years after it had been built for £60,000 in the 1940s. Nobody would take Beaver. It was offered to the Folk and Transport Museum for our headquarters, but we would have taken on the house and couldn't. So in the end, Belfast Corporation decided that it was an eyesore and a danger to children. The estate was broken up for housing and for the Forestry Commission, and in May 1960, the house was blown up by the army. It wasn't the army's fault. Some years ago, I want to mention that it wasn't the army's fault, because years ago I was speaking at East Belfast Historical Society, I think it was, about some of the big houses, particularly about Beaver Park, and I was laying it on with the trial about what a loss it was historically from the Duke of Wellington, and the architecture and everything else. It was the greatest architecture and historic loss Belfast ever had. At the end I was having a cup of tea, and a very elderly man came up to speak to me and said, "I want a word with you in private." Marched me over to the corner and said to me, "I'm going to tell you something, you're not to say a word." And I said, okay, tell me. He said, "I was the man who blew up Beaver Park House." So you have to be very careful in Northern Ireland what you say. But it's a remarkably small place. I was speaking at a fundraiser for the Ulster Museum some years ago. It was a very grand dinner, all sorts of people there. And I was about to tell a very, very scandalous story about the Legge family of Malone House. And I said for a laugh, "I hope there's no member of the Legge family here." And the voice from the back said, "Actually, there's two of us." So I didn't bother with it, but I've been tortured ever since from people who know them to tell them what it was. But it's not in East Belfast, thank God, so I don't have to tell you. The majority of the big houses in East Belfast were over towards the old Hollywood Road around Glenmachan. Most of them laid out and designed and built by a great architect and developer, Thomas Jackson. Belfast was lucky in the period of its greatness to have a few really good architects, and Thomas Jackson was second to none. St Malachy's Church was one of his, but also that wonderful terrace beside Queen's University. As well as being an architect, he was also a very successful developer. We tend to think of housing developers as being charlatans. He wasn't. He designed some wonderful. He laid out Cliftonville in North Belfast, and he laid out Glenmachan at Strandtown to be a millionaire's area for the up-and-coming great. And all sorts of people, Yurts were there. Greaves took 3 houses. The Greaves owned Fort William, or Forth River spinning mills, and a number of the great families had their houses all around Glenmacken. Sir John McClure, the Lord Mayor, was also there at Glenmacken Tower. Sadly, they haven't survived very well, but very few of the great mansions have. Very interestingly, Glenmacken House, which was the grandest of them and was the house of the Yrth, Sir William Yrth's house, was still being lived in as a private house with butler and all in 1979. You know, the past is not that far away. Sadly, no trace of it today. Gone, but Glenmacken Tower is one of the few to survive. The smallest of the houses, Altona, is still there. Altona was Thomas Jackson's own house. He not only built houses for the Greaves family, who were linen wealthy, he also married his two daughters off to the Greaveses, so that the houses he designed, his daughters got. They're the Greaves, and the Greaves were still in Altona through to his family by the end of the 80s, 90s. It was sold recently. Altona's still there. Not as big as the other's lovely house. Now, I had intended to tell you a ghost story about the house at Gooseberry Corner, but it's too late. Also, it's too bright at lunchtime. It'll have to be done, because I have to get the train back, because I came on the train, I must return on the train, and I must be back at the museum for 2:45. So I have to get the 2:10 at all costs. I'll save that for another time. But one thing I would say to you is, in relation to these families and these great houses, is one thing that we don't understand is how wealthy these Belfast people were. You know, we don't really understand. You know, if you take Lord Perry of the Shipyard, you know, we know Ormston House, which hopefully is going to be restored. That was at Perry's. That was only one of Perry's houses. Perry owned Belgrave House in Belgrave Square, one of the greatest mansions in London. It's now the Spanish Embassy. He also owned Whitley Court in Kent, one of the largest country house in Kent, and one of the most expensive estates ever bought in England. He was just one of them. As I say, Wilson, extremely wealthy. Perry, Harland living beside Kensington Palace. The only one who lived modestly was Gustav Wolff, one of the most decent men who ever turned up in Belfast. And I'm very glad that Belfast treated him well. And I have to say, Belfast has had its bigotries and all sorts of things, but I have to say that generally, Jews were well treated in Belfast. Belfast was one of the first cities in Europe to have a Jewish Lord Mayor. Sir Otto Jaffa, who was also an East Belfast man, and a great man. He had to leave Belfast, but it wasn't because he was a Jew, it was because he was German in the First World War, sadly. But Gustav Wolff, I'll just mention a story about Gustav Wolff, which you may have heard, but I love it. Gustav Wolff, at the height of the shipyards, when money was rolling in, was asked how the partnership of four could possibly work. Who was in charge? He says it's perfectly simple. Edward Harland's the engineer and the genius. He started it. He had all the ideas. He designed the ships. Then he said, we had young Wilson then. Brilliant engineer. Wilson builds them. Runs the yard, ensures that every ship is built. And then we've got Perry. Perry does all the deals. Perry could sell ice to Eskimos. Brilliant man, and it all works perfectly. And they said to him, but Mr. Wolff, you're a partner, what do you do? And he says, I'm not absolutely sure, but I do get to smoke some of the best cigars in Europe. But actually, Wolff was a brilliant man and became MP for East Belfast. He was returned, show how popular Wolff was. Wolff was returned 5 times unopposed as East Belfast MP. That's how much Wolff was like. He didn't live in a great house. He lived in a house with the amusing name of the Den in Sydenham, Station Road, Sydenham. It originally had a number, but Wolff, they said to Wolff, he was a very unpretentious man, look, in Northern Ireland, really, when you're a great man, your house is supposed to have a name, not a number. And he says, well, they always call me the Wolff, we'll call it the Den. So what's Den, he said, and that's how it got the name of the Den. And it survived a long time. But Wolff died in Mayfair, 1912. A remarkable man. And I have to finish now because it's 2 minutes off 5 to 2. Very good timing because you won't have time to ask me questions. And I once appeared on radio programme with Sean, what do you call Sean, who does Radio 3 now? Sean Rafferty. I used to go on Sean Rafferty. This was the last time I ever did Sean Rafferty, because he had me on talking about big houses years ago when he was in Belfast. He was a terrible man, you know. And he said to me, we were chatting before it, and he said, look, well, what do you intend to do? And I gave him an idea, and he said, will you take any questions? And I said, look, I will, but you know, 300 big houses in Belfast, the last thing I want is somebody saying, there was a big house up Ard Lane, what can you tell me about it? And Sean said, look, I understand, you know, it wouldn't embarrass you, it'll be fine. I finished the bit, and then he said, now this is your chance. If you've ever wondered about the name of that big house just up the lane, this is your chance. And right that way. It's the last time I ever did it. The runner went to Radio 3 after. But look, it's 5 to 2. It's amazing to see so many of you out. We rattled about a bit, we've covered some of that. It's giving you some interest in East Belfast. It's a great history, really interesting place. Thanks very much.